Wherever you're joining us from, welcome back for the final panel of our event today. This one will be moderated by Silicon Flatirons fellow Jill Dupré, who serves most of her time as the Associate Director of the Atlas Institute here at CU Boulder, where she teaches, studies, and advises graduate students on a pretty wide range of topics. Jill, thank you so much for leading this conversation and bringing us home today. Over to you.
Thank you so much. And thank you, Silicon Flatirons, for this wonderful conference. I've been enjoying the day. As Amy said, I'm the Associate Director of the Atlas Institute here at CU Boulder, where our students and faculty focus on interdisciplinary creativity and invention. And a couple of years ago, we had the pleasure of hosting Alan Kay, who's a Turing Award winner and did pioneering work on windowing graphical user interfaces and object-oriented programming. And when he toured Atlas and talked with our PhD students, he asked a few questions about the technology, but I was a bit taken aback and also grateful for how confrontational he was in asking questions about and challenging how those students' ideas would impact the world for better or worse. And he specifically referenced Facebook as the sort of greatest evil, and the need to really think ahead when introducing technology. And I'm glad that those questions are a part of the culture here, but it also seemed clear that they aren't always asked in companies. And so I love that Amy brought together this group to explore the question of whether sometimes the Zuckerberg mandate of move fast and break things isn't really the right call. And that even if we can do something and make money doing it, it might not be the right thing. And so some of you will remember Google employees walking out over Project Maven, which was an AI-powered surveillance system, and that Google ultimately chose not to renew that contract. More recently, Facebook decided to pause its Instagram Kids project after pressure from both lawmakers and parent groups. And so I'm really looking forward to this panel following up on the excellent conversation in the first two panels. I think I'll introduce panelists as I go, but also be sure to check out their bios on the Silicon Flatirons website. And I'm going to start with you, Eli. Eli Dourado is a senior research fellow at Center for Growth and Opportunity at Utah State University. And Eli, given your experience with policy and innovation, both within startups and now at the Center for Growth and Opportunity, I'm really curious how you think about this issue.
Well, thanks, Jill. I think that as I was kind of mulling over this question, preparing, I really started to just divide the question into like two different dimensions, right? I think that there is an economic dimension and an ethical dimension of the case, right? So let's handle the economics first, right? And in some ways, maybe it's useful to think about like the trivial case, right? So when you're developing a technology, when might you want to put it back on the shelf? So the simplest case is simply like when a company no longer thinks a product is going to be attractive to customers, right? So even if we build this thing and it works, people won't buy it at a price where we can be profitable with it. So don't commit the sunk cost fallacy, like cancel the program. And of course, beliefs about profitability aren't going to be binary. There's a probability weighted vector of possible outcomes. You think there's so much a chance that we're going to be profitable, and some chance that we're going to be less profitable, and even less profitable. It's going to be a disaster. And then you take like sort of a weighted average of that, and so it just kind of depends on your risk tolerance as a company. If you're building that. So that's the trivial case. And then there's, I think, other considerations that are really still basically fundamentally economic. Like, does it open us up to liability, right? And that brings in stuff like security and safety. Is it bad for our brand, right? Like, is it going to harm us in other markets that we compete in? Is this something that our employees are willing to work on? And the key point, I think, for all of these issues is that it's a question of risk tolerance, and different organizations are going to have different answers depending on how much risk they want to take on. And then I think separate from the economic questions, there's the ethical dimensions. And I think I can say very confidently, nobody should ever do anything that's unethical. That part's easy. The problem is who decides what is ethical and what is not ethical, right? And so and of course, you know, there's all kinds of codes of professional ethics and so on. And I think there's at best a tenuous link between various forms of professional ethics and what I would call like real ethics. When I say like people shouldn't do anything that's unethical. And for example, you know, under legal ethics, lawyers are not permitted to form a partnership with non-lawyers for a business that involves the practice of law. Like that's just straight up restricting competition. That's not enforcing real ethical behavior. So I think a lot of fields of like professional ethics are just basically invented by academics so that they have an avenue for publication, or by activists so that they can try to exercise power over people. So like for those of us that watch the show Silicon Valley, we all remember Gavin Belsen's Tethics as an example of that. So anyway, ethics is something that is people don't all agree on, right? And liberalism, like what our society is based on, is almost defined by the idea that we all get to choose our own ethics, that we have pluralism. So, you know, I think people and companies can decide, you know, whether they want to abide by, you know, one of the forms of ethics that, you know, I would consider real ethics, whether it's consequentialism or deontology or virtue ethics or anything else, or they can be nihilists. It's up to them. And then I think underrated is this question of moral risk. So just as in the economics case, there's a question of risk. There's moral risk as well, and we all get to make our own decisions, not only about the system of ethics that we want to adhere to, but the level of moral risk that we're willing to take. And so if you put these both of those dimensions together, you know, what stands out to me is the element of risk, either economic risk or moral risk. And, you know, I would argue and have argued that people have the right to decide that question for themselves, you know, within sort of the legal framework that we've set out. And I think we can also ask whether we as a society are too risk tolerant or too risk averse. And, you know, there are people who, you know, in specific cases seem like we're too risk tolerant in some cases, you know, like you mentioned, you know, maybe we shouldn't have tolerated Facebook. But I think in broadly, in terms of, you know, economic risk, I think we can see, I think overall we're too risk averse as a society, right? And so in economics terms, you can look at this evidence for this in terms of global interest rates, which are extraordinarily low. People are not borrowing large sums of money to go out and do big things in the world. So, that in turn shapes innovation, right? Real world projects are too risky. So what have we seen? We've seen lots of innovation in information technology in the world of bits rather than in the world of atoms. And in terms of moral risk, I think there is a certain sense also in which we're too risk averse, although perhaps in other senses, maybe we're too risk tolerant. But consider something like, you know, I think like in vitro fertilization, which I believe is like 40-something-year-old technology now. You know, what an uphill battle it had to become socially accepted. And today, you know, it's enriched millions of lives and it actually has created millions of lives. And you know, that's in my book a good thing. So my bottom line is that, you know, decisions to cancel technology projects are based on subjective assessments, and any individual actor, you know, for any actor, there may or may not be a bright line that they're willing to or unwilling to cross. And you know, probably on overall for society as a whole, I think we're too risk averse.
Great, thank you. Tiffany, I see you reacting. I'm excited to go to you next. Tiffany Lee is an assistant professor of law at the University of New Hampshire School of Law. And Tiffany, given your expertise with privacy and AI and your work as a legal commentator, I imagine you've seen and thought deeply about some of the products that maybe we wish didn't exist in the market. And I wonder how you think about this big question of whether some products and services simply shouldn't come to market, and then also your reaction to Eli's excellent framework.
Thanks, Jill. Those are great questions to start off with. I mean, I think to start, we have to kind of set a baseline, right? We can say that there are some products that we can mostly agree are bad. And I say this because sometimes, especially in the tech industry, we start to default on this idea that some products or some technologies can be ethically neutral, right? That a new technology could be used for good or for bad. And so we shouldn't do anything about regulation for the technology because it could be good or bad. And I think that that's a nice thing to believe, but in practice, it doesn't really work that way. There are technologies that sometimes are just mostly harmful or very rarely used for good purposes. And I think we want to set that bright line ahead of time just to say that. Now, the difficulty then is we don't agree on what those technologies are, right? So many people would say, for example, that something like facial recognition, a technology that allows a system to identify a person based on an image or video. Some people would say facial recognition technology is always bad and should be banned outright. Others would say that this technology can have some good uses, right? You could argue that the technology could lead to false arrests. It could lead to people being arrested and even given jail time incorrectly. Others might say that it could lead to us finding or solving cold cases. It could lead to greater safety. So even something like facial recognition technology, which is so much talked about in the news, that is still up for debate. So it's hard to draw bright lines. It's going to be a little difficult in this panel, I think, to really agree on what those lines are. I do want to think a little bit about this question that Eli raised, this idea of whether or not society is too risk averse, because that's interesting to me. Prior to my academic career, I worked for a few years in-house as an attorney in technology organizations. And that was always something that I counseled. And I think it's something that any lawyers in the audience, you've all done this, right? We talk about the risks of new technology. If you are developing a new product, or if your company is launching a new product, or even just a new feature, there are risks and benefits. Sometimes those risks can be legal, sometimes they can be ethical. So for example, if you are launching a product that uses a lot of data, a lot of personal data from your users, one of the first ethical risks is always that that data could get hacked, right? You could lose that data, there could be a data breach. The legal consequence could be data breach notifications, you might get lawsuits. The ethical consequence, though, is harder to determine. And that's where a lot of this analysis gets a little squishy. It's hard to say what the ethical lines are, what's too much risk. I would advise startups to really think carefully, depending on your resources, right? Thinking about how you might be able to defend yourself if a case were to come up, thinking about how you might be able to pivot your company if a product really just completely failed, and thinking about how you might be able to respond if your product or your service or your new feature created PR backlash based on privacy or some sort of data misuse or something like that. These are all different risk calculations that you have to make as someone who's part of a company or representing a company. But I think that as an individual, though, you always have power to do something. So you can always make a recommendation for what the company should do or what the project should do. And that can be a recommendation based on external factors like, what's the, this quarterly goal for your specific department. But it can also be based on these muddier ideas about ethics. And I think I just want to bring up a few concepts so we can play around a little bit within this panel. I think the first is this idea of data quality. So no matter what project you're doing, if it involves AI, if it involves machine learning, think about where you're getting your data from. What are your data sources? How much data are you collecting? When you collect the data, what sort of notice and choice are you giving to people, the users who you're getting your data from? I would encourage everybody who is representing anyone in tech or who is in tech to really push back against this instinct that I feel a lot of developers have, which is to take as much data as they can because they can use it someday. I've heard this from so many people, and I understand the impulse, the idea that you can keep the data, use it at a later time. But first of all, this might be violating some laws. The GDPR, for example, has a pretty strict purpose limitation for data being collected. But second, on an ethical basis, there are some problems with that. If you get people to consent to one thing, and then you use their data for another reason, that's ethically questionable. Also, there's, again, greater risk of cybersecurity concerns. If there's a breach, you have so much more data that is at risk of being leaked. So try to push back against that in your general thinking about where the data is coming from and the quality of your data. I think the second thing to consider is really just, have you baked ethics into the product development lifecycle? I think this is really key because regardless of whether or not you ultimately decide to shelve the product or the feature, you've got to make sure that this process is ethical. Because even if this one product fails, the next product is going to come up and is going to have ethical concerns. And you've got to make sure that there are people on your team who are thinking about ethics, people who are classified as, say, privacy program managers, as policy officers. If you are a very large organization or company, you may have people who are actually just ethicists on board. But every single person who's involved in product development, or for example, involved in advertising, which is very data heavy and data driven, should have some training about ethics so they can make these decisions too. Because no matter what your position is, you can't control everything at your organization, but you can encourage other people to take on some of this burden through trainings, through information, through education. Make sure you have people who are able to bake ethics into the product development lifecycle. And the final thing I would want to encourage you to think about is really consider who's on your team as well. So not only should your product development lifecycle include issues of ethics, it should include everyone thinking about ethics, but you should be hiring people who are able to do this work. And this might mean, for example, encouraging, let's say, undergraduate computer science programs to implement, ethical classes as part of the required curriculum. It could also include looking past the certifications and degrees that people you're hiring to see if they've been able to actually fully implement products in a practical level. It could also include asking people questions about ethics during the interview stages. Also, as one general matter that I think we've seen really run into AI ethical concerns, this problem of AI and bias. Many of our automated systems have been exhibiting signs that reflect the biases in society. We've seen examples of, say, paper towel dispensers in bathrooms, not recognizing people with dark skin when they wave their hand under the towel dispenser. That's a small example of an area in which you think maybe if there had been a few more people who had different skin tones on that design team, maybe we wouldn't have run into that issue. So when you think about hiring and you think about inclusion inside your company organization, also remember that there's an ethical choice to be made in how you form your organization. Think about having diverse team members, including people from diverse perspectives on issues like ethics, to sort of help bake in ethics not only to your product development process, but into your entire organization. So just a few thoughts to kick things off. We can get into the more theoretical, difficult decisions about, what is ethics? But I think those are some things I'd like everyone to consider, on the practical level when you're working through these with your own organizations.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. And next I'll go to Austin Chambers, who's an associate at Dorsey Whitney. And Austin, you work with clients on data privacy and security compliance. And I wonder whether and how you ever talk with clients about technologies that might be perhaps too flawed. Oh, I think you're on mute. Oh, and we still can't hear you.
How about now?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, sorry, wrong microphone. Yeah, so it's interesting, coming from in a conversation about ethics, talking about the law and ethics, it's kind of, to me, almost two separate things, because when people come to me and ask questions, they want to know, is this legal or not? And then can we go forward? And so it's always an interesting challenge to me to talk through with clients and, to bring ethics into the conversation. And to me, I think one of the interesting things that we see out of this panel is trying how to build an organization and a process within these companies and within our clients that where they are taking ethics into account, even if that means going above and beyond necessarily what I might advise or what is strictly legal. And I think that's an interesting conversation to have. So on my side, I'll kind of speak today just from a strictly legal standpoint and coming, what is legal, what isn't. And what I think is interesting is that in most cases, privacy and security law, for the most part, it is adaptable to what Eli mentioned as sort of your own ethical frameworks, what you think is appropriate. And it gives you some flexibility to do that and to at least give it a try. There's not a whole lot that is per se illegal. We can say, okay, you can't collect this type of data without maybe getting consent, or you can't use it for this obviously nefarious purpose, that's strictly illegal. Okay, maybe these are easy questions, but there are very few of those, I think. And so what I think is very interesting is the process that I approach when I talk to clients about privacy compliance and risk and everything. We try to think through, what are you really trying to do? What's your objective? What are you actually trying to do? And to take the privacy compliance steps and really use that as a method of really fleshing out the issues and making you accountable for what decisions you want to make. So like, let's take a privacy policy, probably the most simple privacy compliance tool out there. We take that, and so in order to write it, we ask, what are you collecting? Why do you really need this? What are your objectives with this? And I think that that's been a process that I've found with clients. They want a privacy policy, they want it done in an hour, and they think they can pull it off the internet, whereas really, this is the perfect compliance tool. And I found that writing those has actually been something where we get that focus, we start those conversations, and those questions come up. Well, we wanted to do this, we want to do that. And then this is where we can start to take all these product and feature ideas and put them on that spectrum of risk. And then we see perhaps some areas where we say, okay, you could do this. Theoretically, you could do this. But in order to do that, you're going to have to get consent to this. You're going to have to disclose this. You're going to be accountable to the public and your customers because through your privacy policy or through other compliance requirements, in this way. And I think that that's where we've seen, I rarely tell somebody, no, you can't do this. It's just illegal. For the most part, it's like, maybe, but here's exactly what you're going to have to do in order to make that strictly lawful or to mitigate your risk to a degree that you would find acceptable. And so that's what I've found very interesting is, at least in the course of advising people, is it's getting to that yes, and it's helping people to define, refine, and build better products and use privacy compliance as a tool to build that internal accountability and build those internal structures to build better products.
So maybe we can use that jumping off point for a little bit more open discussion. I hear you on this separation between what's legal and what's ethical, and that it's not necessarily your role to talk to companies about what's ethical. But I'm curious how you all respond to whether in the first panel, people talked about creating a culture of ethical behavior. And Tiffany, you talked about ethics as part of the product life cycle. And I'm curious whether you feel like we need more of a mandate for that, or if it's something that should be left to companies to decide how much they incorporate that thinking.
So I think that's an interesting question. It'd be pretty difficult to mandate that. Definitely we can encourage companies to consider ethics. And I think that, what Austin was saying about some of our legal advice actually being ethical advice to an extent, I think that's certainly true. Some laws really implement ethical ideas, right? We have privacy laws that, if nothing else, support the idea that we have an ethical value attached to the concept of privacy. So definitely some of our legal laws and regulations do work to enforce ethical boundaries for companies. But I think we can't ever say every company must be ethical. We've tried it in various laws and it works sometimes and sometimes not. But what we can do is when we're working with a company or advising a company, we can keep that ethical point of view in mind and we can share that opinion. In terms of professional responsibility, lawyers are allowed to advise on ethics. It's not something we cannot advise on. And I think very often when we're talking about risk analysis for various questions from clients, you have to think about the long-term downstream effects, especially if you are working in-house, for example. You're thinking of things like reputational harms if you have a product that's found to be unethical. So I think that's really part of this. It's something that anyone advising a company or working in a company can do. And the law certainly helps, but it's a little bit more specific, right? It'll have one law implementing one ethical standard. Hard to have one law that just says companies must be ethical, don't be evil, but in law.
Great. And any response from the other panelists?
I agree. It's like really challenging to sort of mandate ethics because none of us agree on what's the right ethical code. Do only consequences matter, which is a view held by some philosophers, or do intentions matter as well, right? And so what is for a company to say, okay, it's one thing for a company to say we're going to be ethical, but then it's like this very hard problem of like who's ethics and what are we trying to do. Now I do think like companies, I think it is fitting and proper for companies to sort of have their own view on what is and is not ethical, and for them to try to inculcate that behavior in their employees and through processes and so on. And I think it's also very appropriate for companies to tell their customers what their values are, right? And it can almost become a marketing tool, right? Where the companies say, well, these are our values, and if you are our customer, like we will treat you in accord with these values. I think that's very appropriate. But at the end of the day, there's going to be a plurality of different frameworks that people use for adjudicating these questions, and I think that's okay, and I think that's I don't think we're going to improve upon that.
Yeah, I agree as well. I think, again, coming from my perspective as an outside advisor, I very much agree with Tiffany. It is kind of a challenge between talking to clients about what is strictly illegal, but what ought you be doing, and how do we take these processes and how can we build accountability and ethics into the process and help you think through these issues and use compliance as a tool for building a better organization. I feel like that's kind of been a theme across the panels today, is kind of really understanding how you bring in these different stakeholders, how you use the law as a guide almost to bring in build a better organization, even if the strict yes no is not really there isn't one oftentimes.
Sorry, I got distracted by the chat. On that, I wonder about the pressures on companies, and from each of your perspectives, which pressures seem to be the most effective in terms of if there ever are bright lines, and if there are times when a company would not take a product or a service to market, what are the external pressures that you see being the most effective, be it some of these internal processes and employees kind of blowing a whistle and saying, hey, we need to stop this, consumers, government, and if you can just talk through how some of those forces act on a company's decision.
So I can certainly say, for one, that I've seen, and again, I think we've heard a couple of times across the panels, a cost, just pure cost and risk. You can ask, what are you really trying to achieve with this product? And I would say, I've rarely shelved an idea or talked to a client and said, no, don't do this. But what we have done is say, if you're really trying to do this, is this the best way to do it? Is this the lowest risk way to do it? If you're collecting this information, again, it costs a lot to store it. We have to disclose this. We have to go through all these steps in order to collect it. Can we achieve this in a different way? And I think oftentimes that the cost effect is probably one of the strongest. And the next up is reputation. I've seen clients that if you have to put it out there, if you have to get consent, if you have to be upfront and direct about what you're doing, sometimes that's enough for them to reconsider maybe how they go about it, and if they might want to find a more friendly way to do it. So I think transparency in that sense really it does have some power.
Yeah, and I agree. And yeah, economics can be a tool for ethics in a way, right? Like in the sense of if the customer base has a different view on a question than the company does, well, the company is going to probably have to adopt the view of its customers if it wants to keep them to some extent. So sort of thinking about the bottom line as a tool to sort of check the behavior of companies via the market, I think that works.
Yeah, and so I wonder the extent to which, when we're balancing these ideals of innovation and also protecting consumers, whether we want to shift the balance or whether you're all sort of comfortable with where the balance is now. Like, would we want to have more of an economic impact when products go wrong? Or do you worry too much about how that would impact innovation on the market? And Tiffany, I think to you first.
Great, thank you. It's hard to determine how much we should change that balance. And I'm thinking right now, the first example that comes to mind is Uber and ride sharing. So there is, that's a corporate model where we've seen some ethical concerns develop. There have been allegations that people who are driving have not been compensated fully. They don't have benefits as independent contractors and so on. There have also been cases where people say, they've pushed the taxi industry out. People who own medallions are now in trouble. And I understand these ethical concerns and I get them. I also, though, have a bit of a hard time with this because it's true that I do think, we do need more protections for people who are driving, for example. And people who did own those medallions suffered a huge financial loss and no one has come in to pick up the pieces. At the same time, the taxi industry really did need to be disrupted. I'm sure you all remember trying to take a taxi, 10 or 15 years ago before Uber really took off. And the service was very unreliable in many cities. And in some places, you didn't even have service, right? You had those last mile concerns. So we did need to disrupt the industry. We needed that innovation. At the same time, though, after that first burst of innovation, now we've got into a stage where we do have a new world or a new understanding of how we should be thinking of private transportation. And we haven't caught up. The ride sharing companies haven't caught up. So I think one way to think about this balance is this idea of innovation and disruption of the industry as a little bit separate from the ethical dimensions of what happens when an industry is a little bit more mature. Because I can definitely buy an argument that says early stage Uber, early stage Lyft needed the lack of regulation in order to take off. Certainly, if Uber had actually listened to regulators and complied with regulations when they were first starting as a startup, first launching their pilot projects around the nation, mostly in jurisdictions that were not that were very friendly to them, the company probably wouldn't have taken off at all. It probably would have died at the start. But now, as a mature company, we should be thinking of different ethical standards. And that's something that I think is important when considering this balance. We should support the power of new startups to develop new things, innovate new things. But once they become more mature companies, whether that's through age, through time, through size, through impact, there's got to be a level where we say, well, thank you for the innovation, but the ethical concerns are now overpowering that first burst of newness that we had. So that's something that I've been thinking of a little bit as one dimension of this trade-off that you're talking about.
Yeah, that's great. And Eli, I don't know.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, so I spent some time at a startup working on supersonic airplanes. And so that's like, I think that's an area where, we were highly regulated, very highly regulated. And it does harm innovation. But I don't think it's ethical issues, right? Or it's not like sort of like the voluntary issues that are, the decisions that we made, right, to try to be as safe as possible, right, to et cetera. Like those are not the barriers to innovation. And I think that the barriers to innovation are, sort of it's like poor regulation, shall we say, like, regulation that's overly prescriptive or overly unimaginative and does not leave room for it. So I don't think it's ethics per se that is the obstacle to innovation. It's for most, a lot of times this focus is on the IT industry, but having come from sort of the world of aerospace and stuff, there's a much wider world of innovation that's not digital, and I think the issues are a little different.
Yeah, and I would agree with that overall as well. I think I do see that risk in over-regulation in a sense, but I think kind of premature regulation. I do think that there always needs to be some way to bring accountability, to a company and for their actions and how they handle data and things, which is what I think about most of the time. But I definitely do have concerns that trying to get out too far ahead of it does run that risk of stifling potential innovation and AI in particular. And I'm sure others have more sophisticated thoughts than I do maybe on that particular point, but it's an area where I see a lot of lot of concern today, and I do worry a bit about overregulation as a lot of our clients are really doing innovative things. And I think we try to build in good processes. We try to get them to think about these things, but it is uncertain. But of course, at the end of the day, if they get shut down by regulation, that would be a problem. So
I do want to make a really quick point too. All of this talk about regulation and the threats, if you're advising a company, it's still down to risk tolerance, right? If they're willing to take the risk to go against the current regulation, the current law, go for it, right? That's up to them. If they decide that, the risk that they'll be caught doing something is pretty low, or they're willing to pay the fine, and it's not something that's blatantly, obviously you do not want to advise anything blatantly illegal, but we all know that there are legal gray zones, especially with technology. That's something where it's up to them. It's their risk tolerance. On a lot of these issues on things like AI, things like privacy, cybersecurity issues, sometimes there are those gray zones where you just have to tell the client, it's up to you to think about your own risk. If you want to take that risk, go for it. But here are the potential legal consequences.
And what about if you're advising consumers or employees? If you're talking to the people who are either learning about potential new products or the employees who are working on them, what are the areas that you feel like, hey, anything that impacts this is something that I personally wouldn't be part of, or that I would fight against? And I guess what I'm trying to get at is this panel, is there a bright line? I feel like we've talked a lot about the calculations and we've talked a lot about what you balance, but so far I haven't heard people giving a sort of bright line about if it does this, then no.
Right. So I think, in terms of talking to ordinary people, right, I think the problem is, it's very fundamental, which is that they have to have a well-considered view of what their ethical beliefs are and so on. And I can tell them, I can just yell at them and say, adopt mine. You should all adopt, my particular view of ethics, but that doesn't really work. People have to actually have a considered view. And I think a lot of times ordinary people don't, right? This is not a priority for most people. It's I'm going to really figure out what I believe about what's right and wrong and the nature of that and why, and so that I'm able to evaluate these things. So I think that you're facing, that's the fundamental challenge that we all face, is that there isn't it's not a question that's verifiable in the sense of the way science is. We can sort of prove that things are right, and we can build multi-generational knowledge that keeps growing. Right. With ethics, we haven't really advanced past Aristotle, right? The 2,500, 3,000 years, and it's not a kind of body of knowledge that is objective and that grows over time. So we're all still trying to figure things out, and I think I have a lot of sympathy for people because we're all kind of just thrown onto this planet without really an instruction manual, and we kind of have to figure it out for ourselves.
Great, thank you.
Yeah, I was going to say it's tough. I think that even in some cases where we say there's a clear bright line about what's good or bad, there are still so many downstream effects of technology that it's hard to determine. And I'll just bring one example. I think that everyone on this panel probably agrees that genocide is bad. Genocide is probably ethically bad, right? I'm seeing some nods, good. So that's great. But then what about, for example, if you are a company and you sell surveillance technology to authoritarian regimes, are you contributing potentially to some form of genocide? We don't know. What if you don't even do that? You say, I'm not exporting technology at all. I'm only selling this technology within the US. It won't get there. But because your technology takes off, other people are able to be influenced by your work, or take bits of your design, or even use your products to create their own form of something else, right? That also then has downstream effects of contributing to potential genocide. That's also negative. And if you're representing the company that is making that technology in the first place, that's a really hard question to ask. Is the bright line that you just don't make the tech because it could be misused later? Or is it that you try to maybe bake in some protections? You try to build in a fail-safe of some kind. Is that even possible, right? So I definitely agree with Eli that you can't really draw those lines too easily. And at the same time, if you're representing a company that is working on any sort of tech that could get into questionable ethical territory, you have to somehow help them draw those lines. And that's something where, it's something that I think anyone at a company can do, but you definitely need to be really seriously thinking about these things, doing the reading, doing the research, thinking through all the implications, and not just stopping at this is a fancy new thing that will get a lot of press or will get a lot of new users.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I think one of the, I've not worked with a ton of companies that do anything particularly sensitive, but I think one of the fundamental things that I've realized that privacy is a multidisciplinary sort of subject as a security, right? And so I think one of the important things is, again, it's building that culture. It's bringing all these people into the conversation to have those conversations about what you want to do, where are you going with this, and not making it a pure compliance exercise, but really, working across the organization, developing those relationships. That's been effective for me just from a pure compliance standpoint, but I think it translates very well into building a better organization that is both compliant and I think ethical and able to have those conversations, ask those questions before they become, a very, very serious problem.
Okay, that's wonderful. Thank you all. And I think it's time for us to turn to audience questions. And I know there should be a student question following the Wiser rule. And I think, yep, Taylor.
All right, hello. Thank you so much for that. All right, my question. It seems like, honestly, I think we could determine what's good and what's bad, similar to, genocide and murder and just awful things. Those make it to the bad side, but it is very high level, as most laws are. So I'm just going to jump into my example. Driving a car, we have laws that regulate, rules of the road. We have police officers. We don't stifle engineers from building faster cars, but we also educate drivers through driver's ed, and you have to get a license to operate a vehicle. So something that wasn't really talked about is how can we give consumers or users, tools and education to keep themselves safe, because I feel like that's where it's all starting, and then maybe people will determine that line for themselves.
And so I think one of the interesting things, I mentioned earlier, privacy policies are sort of the foundational privacy, compliance tool, but I think transparency and thinking about better ways to do transparency. And, there's been conversations about iconography and how do you express purposes and, think about street signs. We know what this means. You're entering a dangerous area, or you can do certain things in this space, that you might not be able to do. And people kind of innately understand that. I think it's very hard to express the ethics of your product or even exactly what you're doing. It is challenging, but I think thinking about transparency and coming up with a better way to express these ideas from a company side. And then I think, consumer literacy from technology to, information and everything else is, it's vastly important. We can never underestimate the power of education in a complex world. I think some of these things, frankly, just require true almost education reforms, frankly, just in terms of being able to understand these things. Transparency only gets you so far.
I think education would work if people would do it, but people hate that stuff, right? Like when you go I don't know if you've been part of an organization that has like, every 6 months you have to like go change your password or whatever, and they make you like watch it. Like people like absolutely hate that. Like there's like, they do not want to do those trainings, right? So I think, I mean, there may be an opportunity to, maybe you could get someone to fund like a very entertaining and infotainment version of this, but I think for the most part it's lack of demand. I think even people who have very poor ordinary consumers who have very poor cyber hygiene, I think they just don't want to be bothered with it, and they're willing to take the risks for it. So I think education like would work as a solution, but there has to be demand for it, and I fear like there isn't.
I think there is a demand for privacy, but I don't necessarily think that translates to demand for the sort of education or information gathering that would be necessary to protect your own privacy. I mean, studies have shown even young people right now, a lot of people say, young people don't care about privacy. They very much do. Teenagers today really want privacy. They create their own methods to do it, including, fake social media accounts and so on. But you're right. That's those steps to understand a privacy policy. Being able to read a privacy policy in the first place is already many steps ahead of many people. And why should people have to be able to understand a privacy policy? Of course, we can advise people, companies, to write very easy, very clear privacy policies, but the average policy is written as a contract, or as a pseudo contract. And many people don't want to read that. So when we think about how to empower individual consumers, I think some of it is still education. We can think of different educational methods. Some regulatory agencies put out, fun, PSA videos and stuff like that. We can try to think about, how to translate the desire for privacy into something actionable. So I do like when some writers and newspapers put out, something like, here's a guide to all the settings you should turn off on your phone right now. That's very easy and simple for people to do. Or when people talk about these issues in the public sphere. So, and public newscasts or so on, or in programs for children. I do think something like that could be helpful, could be empowering. And I think that companies can help too. Privacy policies can be simpler. There can be more settings that people can manage on their own. You should be able to have an opportunity to turn different settings off, to make sure cookies aren't being collected, locations not being tracked, what have you. And at the end of the day, what consumers can do most of all is vote with their wallet. If they really hate a company's practices, they can stop using that company's services or products. And one way to empower them then is to make sure that we have a startup world in which there are competitors. Because right now you can say delete Facebook, delete Instagram, but then where do you go? All your friends are on Facebook and Instagram, right? So that's something else we can think about, how to empower the consumer through allowing them to have more choices.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for a great question, Taylor. And while we're waiting for other people to put questions and answers into the chat, Tiffany, I want to follow up on that idea to ask, when you outlined some of the ways to think about this, your second one was, is ethics part of the product life cycle, the product development life cycle? And I wonder if you see people voting with their wallets for companies that have included that.
I don't actually have the empirical research on that. I keep seeing companies try to make it a marketing point. So I would assume that they've done some market research on this. A few years ago, Apple put up huge billboards in some major cities saying things like, we protect your privacy. I think this was around the time right after the Apple FBI case, where they fought against the FBI trying to get into someone's phone. So I do think that companies are using it for marketing. So it must be helpful in some way, I'm guessing. But that's a good point. Maybe people just say they want privacy, but then they still use Facebook, they still use Apple, they still use Amazon, they still use all the tech companies anyway, and they don't vote with their wallets. I think one reason might be that there aren't sometimes other choices. If you don't want to use Apple or Google, what phone are you buying? There are other options, sure, but are there that many options? If you don't want to use any of the major social media platforms, how do you connect to your friends? If you don't want to use Amazon, at this point, in some areas of the country, you really can't buy anything. Like you're stuck with Amazon or Walmart, and that's it. So in the absence of choices, it's really hard to empower people to protect themselves and to align their consumer behavior with their ethics. But that's sort of a much larger systemic issue, and I'm not sure we can solve that just as people advising for or working for tech companies.
Thanks so much.
And I think with that example of Apple in particular, right? I think Apple did something very smart, right? They solved for the equilibrium, which is like they knew that in the future they probably wanted to go into health stuff, right? And if they have a reputation for like not caring about your privacy, then no one's going to use their health products, right? Because people are more sensitive about health privacy than other things, right? And so you see Apple going into the health industry with the watch and collecting a lot of biometric data and stuff like that. But like no one's using like Facebook Health, right? Because Facebook hasn't invested in that reputation to do that. So I think that's like another more like dynamic way in which like market forces are like pushing companies to behave differently depending on their future plans.
Yeah, that's a great point. Okay, so we have some questions in the Q&A. Michael asks, even if you teach consumers how to read a privacy policy, who's reasonably going to read the microprint 20-page policy to install an app? Should it be regulated like the GDPR?
Yeah, so I'll take that one. So I mean, I think first off, the GDPR does set out standards, and if you want to pick a reason why privacy policies are longer than ever, the GDPR is a pretty good reason. Not to say that it's bad necessarily, and frankly, it's actually good because GDPR forces you to talk about specific processes, specific data, to tie all these things together. What people used to say and what Google, did for many, many years was talk about things in very, very overarching language. We use your data to improve products and services, which is a great way to say that we mine everything in every way, to sell better ads, fundamentally, and to do all kinds of other stuff that we may or may not know about. Whereas now the GDPR requires that specificity, but of course with that specificity comes a cost, and that's in terms of time, comprehension, and there's the oft-stated quote that if you were to read every privacy policy that you were subject to on a given day, you'd be reading, every waking hour of a year. This is why I think it's a challenge, right? Like you want to empower consumers to make the choices themselves, and that's why I think iconography and what Apple's done now, which is try in some way to standardize the disclosures through the App Store with the mandatory sharing disclosures and the data use disclosures. I think it's a difficult problem to solve, but it's still at the core, in my mind. If you want that consumer choice, transparency and understanding still are two conditions of that.
Thanks. And Liz asks, do you ever see the consumer or citizen having as much voice as the business in this area of technology, ethics, and data privacy?
I mean, I think that the individual citizen probably no, right? But like collectively, like, if you have like a lot of people who are, essentially like the customer base, right? They are actually pretty sovereign, right? Like companies do what their customers tell them to do. So I think people can get frustrated, oh, this company is not doing exactly what I want. But I think if the customer base as a whole is paying attention and cares, companies are pretty responsive to what they want. So I do think a lot of the power lies in the hands of ordinary people.
I also want to note that people aren't just consumers, right? We also are citizens. So I think Liz also asks, is our wall our only voice? And I don't think that is. We can definitely, stop using, Facebook if we want, stop using Uber, whatever. We can, make a fuss online. Social media campaigns have caused huge hits to companies in the past. But not only the market forces, right? We can try to talk to our own representatives. And that's happened. We've seen some people in government really take a strong stance on technology ethics, partially because their constituents really want it and care for it. So that's another way you can try to, get a voice, a larger voice in the system, not as a consumer, but as a citizen. And of course, as an individual, empower yourself with education and information, learn as much as you can, and do as much as you can to protect yourself and people as well.
I'll just add, I agree with what Tiffany says, but I would caution that there's moral risk entailed in making things illegal too, right? So when when you make something illegal, what you're doing is you're enforcing that societally with violence, right? You're saying potentially we could get into a situation where the FBI has to march in and like violently rip someone out of their chair and take them to jail. And so that itself entails moral risk. So we should be cautious about that as well.
Yeah, I think some of those issues would get teased out in the anonymous question of governance can be the start of a solution to a complex regulatory or social issues. Does governance have an important role to play here, or is this a place for a more populist solution? Or is it really both?
I believe the governance does have a role to play. I mean, again, the law is a reflection of ethics. I think that's another thing that we've mentioned a couple of times here on the panel so far. And it's insofar as there is something that we can identify as a society that is bad, then yes, we can outlaw that, or we can create a regulation or a process around enforcing, that idea. So, I mean, take consent. Whether or not we require someone to be fully informed and you actually have to do something in order, for this to happen to you, for your data to be processed in this way. So, that would almost never happen without regulation. If you didn't explicitly require consent in some cases, I think that I'm not sure that it would happen. I don't think there's enough market demand for it. And I would also add that sometimes, regulation can be a source for innovation. You can set up guardrails and sometimes people will innovate. They'll think through, achieving this purpose in a different way. Say, okay, well, you can't go about it this way, but people are creative and companies are endlessly creative about these things. And sometimes they'll find a better way to do it. And I think, regulation can provide those guardrails. It may not be efficient.
Michael asked, just because a company is willing to accept the risk, should I be allowed to put my data at risk? Full stop on the corporate wallet being the arbiter on what is ethical development.
I think that's a larger ethical question, right? Sometimes a company can be fully in compliance with the law, but maybe they're not acting in accordance with what one might consider ethical. And I think it can definitely be something where many people, I would say, believe that certain privacy laws are not strong enough and that companies themselves are not doing enough to protect individual data. So then, based on that sort of ethical decision, we have to think about what we need. We need better corporate standards. We need better regulations. Do we need better technology? I think Austin mentioned innovating around regulations or around technology. We've seen some privacy preserving or privacy enhancing technologies develop specifically to help people still innovate, still use the data, but still protect privacy. So we can argue that there should be more done there. And I definitely see your point. A lot of people, I think, are on your side with this. Even if the company wants to take the risk, the individuals don't. So perhaps there could be more that could be done. Certainly, I think we can always do more.
Okay, I think we will end there as we're about out of time, but I just want to thank the panelists so much for continuing the Silicon Flatirons tradition of elevating the debate. I really appreciate your thoughtful and sort of balanced responses to all of the questions. So thank you so much. And thank you to Amy and Silicon Flatirons for putting this on.